about it. So it becomes a responsibility, duty of those who are literate and educated to raise these concerns so that the Supreme Court addresses this in the manner it should, and then the Parliament must make a law to ensure that all people, irrespective of their sexuality, irrespective of their gender, choose to want to get married because their rights, their obligations, privileges are protected by laws. The Parliament must enact such a law, a special law if there is no law.
Akkai Padmashali, let me come to you now. The language that has been used by the centre as a part of its affidavit before the top court of the country is something that in fact made headlines. They have described, as Ms. Adige was pointing out, the demand for same-sex marriage as an urban elitist view. They've also described the LGBTQ community as a minuscule minority. Your quick thoughts on this assertion being made before the top court by the central government?
Yeah, I think this is so unfortunate to listen from my government. And I want to say that I feel pride and proud to be part of our Indian democracy, Indian culture, Indian tradition, and especially from the state of Karnataka. I think we also live in a society called the majoritarian and a totalitarian concept, which I really take my objection on it. But I think I would really urge and request my government to rethink its decision before judging one community's identities. I think I would also say under the constitution morality, I'm just claiming my right, saying that I decide my gender, I decide my sex, I decide my sexuality, I decide my life, and I decide my marriage. I want to see a governance which can respect people's issues than the political agenda.
Interesting. Let me then ask you a follow-up question. Speaking of the centre's stance, one of the arguments that was made by the Solicitor General today before the top court is that, look, we've done so much for the trans community. We've recognized their rights. We've recognized, we've in fact introduced criminal provisions that would disincentivize any actions against the trans community. But having said that, the government yet remains consistent with its position that marriage can only take place between a biological man and a biological woman, and thereby denying the trans community access to this right to marry. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I would really say this is such a sexist thinking perspective, which is really not supported, number one. Number two, the Honorable Supreme Court of Judgment of 2014, the National Legal Services Authority of India, which has said transgender are equal citizens before Constitution of India. That's one. 2018 constitutional verdict on Section 377 has also recognized respecting and accepting people's sexual identities and gender identities as are concerned. So these two judgments are on the grounds of constitutional morality. Now my request again go back to the government. When the top court in the country has recognized the least section of society, that's we the sexual minorities, who are vulnerable, discriminated, stigmatized on various grounds of our identities and sexualities, I think the again question posed back to the government, how can a system of justice can be denied to one section of society? How can a system of society exclude one section of society? The only plea that what we're asking as a community, we do also, you are human beings, we also have our dreams, we also have our desires. Respecting those humankind, human community, the government shall need to stand with the most oppressed section of society. The third point and the final point would be, how many member of parliamentarians are going to speak about sexuality and gender before the utmost parliament which where I belong to? I feel very, very minuscule in numbers. As member of parliamentarians, how many of them have understood the politics of sex, the politics of gender, the politics of sexuality? I don't see my representative, very few heads like Mr. Shashi Tharoor. We lost Mr. Arun Jaitley, who was the best person who was speaking and supporting the rights of sexual minorities. These people are not in the parliament today. Very unfortunate that this shall be standing in favor of the movement than deciding and dictating against one community.
It's interesting you mentioned the politics of this all. We'll, of course, address that in a bit. We'll come back on that subject. But as far as the government's defense is concerned, the government's argument appears to be that, look, we're only the means of a larger public view, of a representation of the popular view of the country. And that seems to be the defense that, look, we don't know how a fisherman in South India thinks about the issue. We don't know how a businessman in the north may think about the issue. And therefore, perhaps it is best that this issue is left to the wisdom of the legislature, of the state legislature, of the parliament. That's the argument being made here by the centre. Ms. Adige.
I disagree. If that is their only concern, there is no dearth of various forms of consultation that the government can indulge in. Engage with the fishermen, engage with domestic workers, engage with anybody the government cares to hear and listen to the voices of. Nothing stops them from doing that. So when the government again says it's a minuscule number, will the elected representatives ignore the votes and the taxes paid by this minuscule number? If they are going to give up on all of that, then they have a right to make this kind of a talk, this kind of a language using phrases of minuscule number, urban elite. That is unacceptable, because I think that is just excuses for not wanting to address the matter. That unless you recognize and acknowledge that every citizen, even if there is one citizen who might think in this manner, that citizen's rights are not upheld, not safeguarded, that too from the apex court, the parliament is not going to give too much of a discussion and concern to it. And the courts have been known in the past to have made these kind of, what should I say, statements. And that dynamism, that activism, the judicial activism is important. If they do not do so, then the parliament would continue to still argue about adultery being a crime. The parliament will continue to harp on personal laws. The parliament would continue to harp on a talaq that is okay because it's a personal law that allows it. So today we want to ask the apex court that you need to place on record that this is a serious concern, that it must be acknowledged and recognized that gay people, lesbians, trans persons, LGBTQ have the right to demand that their marriages are legitimized and recognized so that they can avail all the other rights as per the laws and constitutional guarantees.
Sure. We also have joining us on the show Tanushre Bhalla. She's a lawyer. She's in fact an intervener in this very case that's pending before the top court. Ms. Bhalla, thank you so much for joining us. First question I want to ask is with an understanding, to give us an understanding of what the real world implication is of being denied the right to marry. The understanding, of course, that has been put before the court is that, look, most rights that accrue to people fall out of their relationships, their blood relations or marriages. And therefore, not being allowed to marry has very real-world implications. What are these real-world implications that the community here is tasked with when the government itself denies this right to marry?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, Ashmit. The real-world implications are so serious, they may start from something as small as health insurance or a spousal ticket on an airline and go to as serious concerns as it may be, say, end of life rights or, signing up for somebody in an emergency at the hospital. And what happens is, as a result of this, a lot of people, not only are they being denied rights, it is seen that, when two people have been living together, even in a union, like a same-sex union, at the end of the day, when one spouse expires, these people may fall prey to, circumstances or malicious elements in the society who want to take advantage of the situation. So it is basically anything and everything that affects your right and which affects your life is affected by this. For example, as a person, as an ally, even I can sympathize with the fact that, for example, tax. You may gift each other without any issues, like Mr. Rohadgi correctly pointed out. But if it is somebody I haven't married, then I can't do that. So these are very daily issues that, affect people. Something that straight people take for granted.
Is an issue which
something that straight people take for granted every day, same-sex people realize what actually the importance and sanctity of marriage is in society. And that's what the right of life is. That's what the life that they are losing on.
Well, that in fact was was one of the arguments that was forwarded by Mr. Mukul Rohatgi, as Ms. Bhalla was pointing out, that Mukul Rohatgi, senior advocate, arguing before the top court, said that, look, this entire community is being steamrolled here by the centre's view of what a homogeneous society should look like. That, of course, was the submission made before the top court. With that, we'll slip into a very short break, but we'll continue this conversation with the benefit of our panelists on the other side of this very short break. Well, welcome back. We are in conversation on the subject of same-sex marriage being debated here before the top court. The arguments, we understand, will continue tomorrow as well. But speaking of the arguments, Ms. Adige, let me come to you. One of the arguments that had been put forth by Mukul Rohatgi is that the centre's stance appears to be is that, look, we've decriminalized Section 377. Actually, not the government, the Supreme Court did. And that should be the be-all and the end-all as far as this debate is concerned, and that there is no further room for expansion. The petitioner's understanding appears to be is that that was only a milestone in a journey as it continues to evolve, the definition of gender and the rights that accrue to them. Your quick take on that. Was Section 377 as far as we can go, or does this require further judicial intervention from the court?
Certainly requires a lot of judicial interventions from the court. If the court today recognizes that domestic violence, victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, of live-in partners, they can take the help of the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, then they have to move further on where same-sex marriages are concerned. And if they do not, and they claim that, 377, we've done our best, that isn't enough. They've done it after so many other countries have had removed it. And so it is important that unless and until the court looks at it, why are we looking at it? Because when we talk of relationships, it's always dynamic. And this dynamism then also asks for rights to be protected. Irrespective of the sexuality, of their gender, relationships, marriages is asked for because that relationship must be protected. If one of the parties is shortchanged, where do they go and get the support and help from? What is the legal mechanism available for these people? They are saying that Special Marriage Act does not apply to them. So what else applies to them? Just removing 377 is not enough. That was a prudish British insertion over there, and then now they have removed it, and they think that they have done charity to the LGBTQ community, and that is enough. That is unacceptable. That is wrong. That is very narrow definition and thinking of the court. So that is why the court today needs to go forward to say rights of all people must be accepted and upheld, and that is the job of the apex court, which means these understandings that are patriarchal, which are narrow, which they talk about, whether it is the Muslim community or the Christian community or any other religion, you go beyond that, because these are constitutional values that the court will now guarantee and say, now we will give you a mechanism so that you can get what is rightfully yours.
Sure. Ms. Bhalla, let's now talk about the way forward. One of the concerns that had been raised by the Solicitor General is that, look, many laws will be rendered unworkable on account of the changes that may perhaps be introduced if the Supreme Court were to recognize same-sex marriages. For instance, the CRPC, the rights that would then accrue to female prisoners as opposed to male prisoners. Then, of course, we have personal laws, Hindu personal law, Muslim personal law. Does that then make the task more onerous in terms of realizing this ambition of the LGBTQ community? Does that make it a little more difficult in terms of realizing these aspirations?
So first of all, the fact is that the Honorable Court has decided not to touch personal laws as of now. That is the prerogative of the Honorable Court, and we have faith in them to, in their wisdom, to decide the same. That is one thing. But from what I can understand and from what anybody may understand on record is, I will share a very publicly known matter which is not related to this particular case, would be that of a celebrity transgender person who was married to a straight man very recently. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to take her name on live, so I will avoid that. But then that particular lady went ahead, sought divorce in that marriage. She got the divorce, she got domestic violence protection as well. And if she hadn't been granted that by the honorable courts in MP and Delhi, she would have been suffering abuse and violence for God knows how long. Similarly, the Madras High Court also gave an interpretation wherein the role of a wife or a husband was considered to be a social role, wherein a person who identifies as a woman can be in that role. So you have to understand that we also have transgenders now, and transgenders are not existent today. Transgenders have existed in our society for thousands of years. They've always been there. They were just marginalized too much. So now if we are saying that, okay, we recognized you because of the court in Nalsa, but we are not going to give you the right to genuinely live, then how is the right complete? As ma'am clearly said that 377 was abrogated, fine. But then it is not just about living inside the bedroom, you also step out. Even when I had put the intervention, that was a point that I had also
That's a very interesting comment that you make, that it's not, it's a very interesting comment that you make, that it's not just about staying in the bedroom. Once a person steps out, there is also an aspiration for dignity in life that one hopes for. One of the arguments that was extended by Mr. Mukul Rahatgi as well. We're running out of time. Akkai Padmashali, let me come to you. You had earlier mentioned political leaders who had come out in support of the cause for LGBTQ community. Is that something that disappoints you, that now perhaps we've seen a lot more issues? In fact, we saw the whole of the parliament session washed out on account of Adani. But this is something that, despite being an emotive issue, doesn't quite elicit a response from the political community. Is that disappointing for you?
I think it is lacking of people's representative who are supposed to speak for the entire nation, and the section of society we are really marginalized today are not speaking, number one. Number two, I think knowing that there is so much of burning issues in the country, that is also important. Along with that, sexual minorities agenda is also very much important. I think saying this and knowing this, I would really request my government to reconsider its decision, number one. Second thing, I do have my utmost faith on our Indian judiciary, because it always stood with the members of sexual minorities, and I hope that that will continue to mainstream our issues in 21st century. Thank you so much.
Mr. Adige, we're running completely out of time, just 30 more seconds. Even if the Supreme Court goes ahead and recognizes the same-sex marriage, what do you think the execution on the ground will look like? We've seen what the Supreme Court judgment on Sabrimala did. We've seen the Jallikattu verdict and what it did on the ground. Do you see this judgment being accepted if it comes on the ground?
Acceptance, social acceptance, sanctions are going to take time. So it was also with domestic violence. So it was with rape. So it was with live-in partnerships. So it will take time, but again, we are evolving, we are dynamic, and yes, there will be an acceptance in course of time. But the seed has to be sown now, and it has to be strongly done so by the apex court.
Right. Indeed, the hearing, we understand, will continue tomorrow, but that is all the time that we have. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Court Corner. Stay tuned. News and updates continue right here on CNBC TV 18.